There's a vacancy at the top of the Church of England. Technically not, as the King holds the title of Supreme Governor, but to all intents and purposes it's the Archbishop of Canterbury who's in charge, and there's not been anyone in that role for almost a year now. We're going to explore what the future holds for the Church of England, some of the key issues that the new Archbishop will have to deal with, and the somewhat strange way the Church of England even ends up with a new leader. Welcome to UCB's Life Issues. I'm David Peake from UCB News. Let's start at the beginning, getting on for a year ago, when Justin Welby announced he was resigning from the role. Joining me for the first part of this week's Life Issues is Bishop Mike Royal, the General Secretary of Churches Together in England, to explore what legacy he leaves behind.
Churches Together in England has 6 presidents, and Justin Welby, as the former Archbishop of Canterbury, was one of those 6 presidents. So I worked very closely with him ecumenically. And I think that would be my first reflection, that Justin Welby was very open in terms of his ecumenism, very strong on the importance of ecumenism, and actually developed very strong relationships with other denominational leaders and indeed other presidents within the Churches Together in England family. So from an ecumenical point of view, I think his emphasis on the importance of good ecumenical relationships is something that he will be remembered by. I think that during his tenure, Archbishop Justin had some very difficult things to deal with, including the whole vexed issue of human sexuality, which threatened to divide the church. I think that his view was always that the church was better by staying together. And sadly, because of the issues around safeguarding, he had to step away from his role and step down as the Archbishop of Canterbury. But despite that, I think in terms of human sexuality, I think that because of the way in which the church handled that actually we may be in a place where the church stays together and finds a way forward rather than splinters and divides. Lots of people very critical on all sides of the way the former Archbishop of Canterbury handled the issue of human sexuality and equal marriage. But I was at the recent synod, and I have to say there was a better tone, and I'm hoping that in February 2026, when it is a main item on the synod agenda, I'm hoping that it is a more cordial conversation and debate.
Bishop Mike Royal of Churches Together in England there, and we'll be returning to that particular issue as well as other hopes and concerns for the tenure of the new Archbishop a little later. But as Mike Royal mentioned, the legacy of Justin Welby's time at Lambeth Palace has to be seen through the lens of safeguarding. The Church of England's hardly unique in having had a culture that allowed the abuse of children and of vulnerable adults to happen. It's also hardly unique in having, in some cases at an institutional level, covered up such abuse in the past. Failure to ensure that past abuse was properly investigated and dealt with was ultimately why Justin Welby resigned as Archbishop. So with that in mind, let's hear from someone whose job is literally all things safeguarding. Justin Humphreys is Chief Exec of the Christian charity 318, and I asked him to look at how the Church of England had managed such matters over the 12 years that Justin Welby was in post.
Despite quite a bumpy journey, if you were to look at the start point and the end point and compare the two, I would have to say that, yes, of course, progress has been made. I mean, one measure alone, which, of course, is not the most important necessarily or the only one, but back in 2010, the Church of England shared a part-time safeguarding officer with the Methodist Church. That was it. That was the entire resource for the Church of England. We now have a situation where there are extensive resources at the disposal of the Church of England, and it might be argued that even still, it's not enough. There are a variety of views on that, but I think I would say yes, there undoubtedly has been progress. There has been a positive change, but there have still been mistakes made along the way. There are still things that need to be done that haven't yet been done. So it's an ongoing piece of work. There is no room for complacency within the Church of England or frankly anywhere else across the church. It's really a need to lean in and be prepared to make demonstrable efforts towards further change.
And I understand, because of the nature of what 318 does, supporting both institutions in trying to put policies in place and to some extent doing investigations, but also in supporting people who may have dealt with being on the receiving end of safeguarding incidents, that you can't talk about individual cases. But can you speak at all to the culture? Because you brought that out quite strongly in our conversation earlier, that safeguarding is not just about the numbers, the policies, the amount of people or resources that are put into meeting the criteria. It's about the culture within an organisation, and in this case, the Church of England. How has that culture evolved over the last 12 years?
That is very much harder to identify. But what I would say is that there is some evidence that culture is indeed shifting. Has it got to where it ought to be? No, I could not say with confidence that has yet occurred. And of course, culture, if we think about what that means, in essence, it's the DNA of an organization, a setting, a context. It's the way that context operates. It's how it is viewed, how it's understood, what people can come to expect by being a part of it. The Church of England has an enormous challenge in that it is not a single entity. It's a broad range of different entities with different governance arrangements that all come together and try to hold a unified sense of culture. And that is an incredibly difficult thing to do. But I think the difficulty that we find is that culture is not seen and experienced consistently yet. That is a mountain to climb, and I would be really keen to see the Church of England being very clear about its intentions as to how it plans to continue changing and embedding a safer culture that will enable those who have been victims of harm within the church to have greater confidence that they will be safe in speaking about their experiences and confident in what the outcome might be having done so.
And you mentioned victims there. Again, without going into personal details, because that wouldn't be fair, what does that lack of consistency across the Church of England do for those who believe that they have been victims of a safeguarding event, or those who are trying to support them?
If we are going to put survivors first, if we are genuinely committed to listening to them, trying our best to understand their experience and the impact it has had upon them, and they need to be in an environment where they first feel safe to speak about those things. What we have found all too often is that victims and survivors have built up the courage within themselves to speak in what they have seen as a very hostile and closed environment, and have had that courage returned to them void. Void in a sense that they've been dismissed, belittled, diminished, devalued, not listened to, not heard. The re-traumatizing impact that has upon a victim of harm and abuse cannot be overstated. And there's a responsibility for the church in all its traditions and expressions to do better in that regard, because I believe that that is what's incumbent upon us as Christians, that we act with compassion, that we value our brothers and sisters. And if we're going to take that to heart and demonstrate that fully and appropriately in a safeguarding sense, that means probably we're going to have painful conversations and have to bear some responsibility for the impact that we have caused.
Justin Humphreys is the Chief Executive and Head of Safeguarding Development at Christian Charity 318, and we'll be hearing from him again a little later. Considering that the process to choose a new Archbishop of Canterbury has been going on so long, we've heard very little about what has actually happened. We do know there was a public consultation on what the wider population of the UK in general and England in particular might need from the person who takes on the position. Bishop Mike Royal of Churches Together in England says that the appointment of a new Archbishop of Canterbury has a built-in mechanism to try and make the new office holder acceptable to other Christian churches too.
That consultation process takes a long time. It is not just within the denomination, but it's beyond the denomination, particularly because it is the state church. So ecumenical colleagues are also consulted about what kind of archbishop they would like to see. So it's a long and drawn out process, not like the Catholic process, which, a few days and the white smoke comes. The Church of England is a very different proposition.
You've already mentioned that the process is different to perhaps what most churches would do because of the unusual status of the Church of England. Who actually is involved in making this choice? Who's on this commission? And does that matter?
You have people from the Church of England here in England, but you also have people from the wider Anglican communion. I think that because of the Church of England's status within the wider Anglican communion, then it is really important that there is representation from around the globe as well as from this country. But of course, because it's a state church, there is also involvement from the government as well, and representation feeding into the process from the government as well. But really, it is the Church of England and the wider Anglican communion who, as I understand it, will make a decision and then put forward a recommendation to government.
Mike Royal of Churches Together in England, and we'll hear a little more from him later in this week's Life Issues. We got a little bit of information a few months ago when a statement was put out by the group of people who meet specifically to deliberate and pray on the matter of who to name as the new Archbishop. But the process is pretty secretive. When the Crown Nominations Commission was put together to find a new Bishop of Ely last summer, they actually failed to reach consensus. That's a situation everyone involved would be keen to avoid this time around. To explore how this all works in practice and why the Church of England does things so differently, let's hear from David Torrance, constitutional specialist at the House of Commons Library.
From about the 1960s, a demand grew for sort of specialist research by people who worked at the House of Commons Library. And today that has blossomed into an astonishing array of specialist briefing papers on every subject under the sun. And our driving ethos is impartiality. We're quasi-civil servants, so we don't make arguments or push an agenda. We're simply providing members of Parliament and, by extension, their constituents and members of the public with empirical information, with the facts of any issue, which will inform debate in the House of Commons and also hopefully inform voters outside of it.
OK, so empirical information for members of Parliament. Here's an empirical piece of information for you. As we sit having this conversation, the Church of England has nobody in the top position, and actually hasn't done for many months. ordinarily, with a religious organisation, with a church denomination, I wouldn't have thought that members of parliament or politicians in general would have much to do with that process. But with the Church of England, it's a bit different. Why is that?
It's different primarily because the Church of England is an established church within the United Kingdom, the other being the Church of Scotland, but they're established in different ways. At root, established means there is a relationship between a church and the state in which it functions or operates. In the case of the Church of England, it's quite an intricate, extensive relationship. Perhaps the most visible component are the Lords Spiritual in the House of Lords. So one of the Houses of Parliament actually has legislators who are bishops or archbishops in the Church of England, and that goes back centuries. The King doubles up as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, but also as part of Parliament. It's the Crown in Parliament. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's the spiritual leader of the church, the established Church of England, has a fairly prominent role in various other bits of the UK constitution, including at the coronation of a new monarch, at services at the beginning of a new parliament. Historical aspects in which there was a direct flow of cash through tithes and other taxes from the state to the Church of England, those were abolished mostly in the 19th century. But to this day, in 2025, the Church of England does have a prominent place in the UK Constitution, which others do not.
And is it because the King, and by extension, as the group of people who kind of execute the will of the Crown, the government, the Prime Minister and a group of ministers, is it because of the King's role that politicians have any kind of say in the leadership of the Church of England at all? Like, how does this work?
Originally, in the 16th century, and indeed legislation from then still plays a part in the appointment of bishops and archbishops, it was entirely the King's decision, although the legislation fudges it by saying he chooses somebody for election, which is a bit of an oxymoron. By custom, and in common with lots of other aspects of government in England, Britain, and then the UK, the powers of the monarch came to be exercised on the basis of what's known as ministerial advice. And that usually comes from the Prime Minister in the most important respects, but can also come from the Lord Chancellor, from the Foreign Secretary, and so on. And during the 19th century, it increasingly became the custom that the monarch was advised in the appointment of bishops and archbishops, and indeed hundreds of other posts in the Church of England, by the Prime Minister. As I say, that happens in lots of other respects. It's the Prime Minister who advises the King. Once again, now it changed recently to dissolve Parliament. It's the Prime Minister who advises the King to appoint ministers in the government, and so on. So bishops and archbishops is one of a myriad of duties where the Prime Minister plays that role.
So could you just explain where we are at in this process now, and how we get from here to having a name that has been technically advised to the King to appoint, but essentially appointed?
Back in November 2024, Justin Welby announced his resignation. That kick-started a pretty lengthy process, but in December, the Canterbury Diocese, the vacancy in see process began, and that considers the needs of the Diocese of Canterbury. The Prime Minister appointed Lord Evans of Weardale to chair the Canterbury Crown Nominations Commission, the main body which will come up with a name for the next Archbishop. Usually a Crown Nominations Commission is chaired by the Archbishop of Canterbury, but obviously in this case that can't happen. Towards the end of January, the Archbishop's Secretary for Appointments wrote to the members of the General Synod with expected timings. The following month, a consultation was launched to inform the Commission's consideration of the needs of the mission of the Church of England. and also the wider Anglican Communion. In May, we had a further announcement of nominations commission members, and things sort of got moving more substantially at the end of that month when the Diocese of Canterbury's nominations commission nominees were announced. And then on the 30th of May, it convened for the first time to, quote, pray, reflect, and nominate a candidate. The next stage is in September 2025, at least according to the Archbishop's Secretary for Appointments, the third and final meeting of the Crown Nominations Commission. And from that, one assumes shortly after it concludes, will emerge a name, their recommendation, if you like, as the next Archbishop of Canterbury.
This is an interesting scenario because you have somebody appointed by the Prime Minister to act as chair of the commission, who, according to the Prime Minister's whim, might or might not have any kind of connection with the faith and with the organisation that is putting it forward, trying to get to who is going to head up the running of this church day to day. Is there any kind of guidance on how the Prime Minister or the government of the day and this commission is meant to balance those needs, the spiritual needs of the people of the Church of England and the needs of the country as a whole, with an established church that has a role to play in the functioning of government?
Especially to a non-Anglican such as myself, it does seem a bit opaque. It's not altogether clear what praying and deliberation means. One assumes it's just reflective discussion. And of course, these meetings of the Crown Nominations Commission take place in private. I don't think they're minuted. There was a press release after the first meeting which didn't tell us very much. So it is actually quite a secretive process. What's more concrete are the rules, the standing orders of the General Synod and the Vacancy and See Committee. And there it's much more clear in that the Crown Nominations Commission for an Archbishop of Canterbury has to include 5 representatives from the churches of the Anglican Communion in 5 global regions, being Asia, the Americas, Africa, Europe, and Oceania, and in a non-voting capacity, its Secretary General. At least 2 of the 5 voting members of the Commission have to be female, and a majority of voting members' ethnicity must be global majority heritage, which is the terminology used by the Church. Otherwise, your guess is as good as mine. No one applies to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, which would be the usual form in a secular recruitment process, certainly for the leader of any other large public organisation. And eventually, the Crown Nominations Commission, as I say, in its third and final meeting in September, has to agree by at least 2/3 of the voting members in a secret ballot a single name to go forward as Archbishop. But interestingly, the standing orders also make provision for a second sort of backup candidate. But that name is kept in reserve in case it becomes, quote, impossible to appoint the first preference, which raises all sorts of interesting situations.
And I wonder, because in terms of the existence of these respective roles, we've very recently had the appointment of a new Pope to lead the Roman Catholic Church through the conclave process, which in no small ways, because of a film by the same name, I think we feel like we perhaps understand a little bit more now than we did a few years ago, and that's happened very recently. Are there similarities and perhaps contrasts that we should be aware of between that and what the Church of England and the Nominations Commission are going through at the moment?
It's an interesting point, and it was an excellent and very well-timed movie. I mean, I guess that's also a deliberative process involving prayer and reflection and discussion and indeed voting. It also takes place in private. However, the main difference is it takes place much more quickly. I mean, it could have taken longer than it did. I think the Vatican made some changes a few years ago, which does time limit the election of a new pope, but it can't last as long as it does in the Church of England. Another contrast, I guess, is the Archbishop of Wales. That's the head of the church in Wales, disestablished, of course, in 1920. That took place recently, and I think only took a matter of days, perhaps just a weekend meeting of the church in Wales. And the Church of Scotland, although it doesn't have bishops or archbishops, it of course has a moderator who leads that church, who emerges through another rather opaque process once a year. That's much more familiar to me. But yes, each church does things in its own way. But yes, there are similarities. The main difference, as I say, is the timescale.
So far in this week's Life Issues, we've thought about the legacy of Justin Welby's tenure as Archbishop of Canterbury and tried to understand the process through which his replacement is being chosen. But after 9 months without someone in the top job, what might the future of the Church of England be? What are the competing priorities that the new resident of Lambeth Palace will have to consider? In the time we have, it's impossible to cover everything that the new Archbishop will have on their plate, but we have to start somewhere. So let's go back to Bishop Mike Royal of Churches Together in England.
Yeah, I think two things for me are vitally important. I think it is someone who can bring all sides of the polemic on a variety of issues together. I think that's really important. Holding the communion together, I think, is a key role of influence that the Archbishop of Canterbury plays. I think the second important role is also ecumenical relationships as well. And I certainly know that during the tenure of Archbishop Justin Welby, there were close relationships built with a variety of different churches, including the Roman Catholic Church, and in particular the former Pope Francis. So I think that ecumenical role is really important. And then obviously as the General Secretary of Churches Together in England, then relating to us as the ecumenical instrument of the churches in England will also be very important.
Bishop Mike Royal of Churches Together in England, who hopes that a new Archbishop can hold the Church of England together on a variety of potentially controversial subjects, will no doubt be challenging. Ros Clark is Associate Director of Church Society, which doesn't accept the concept of women priests and does not believe intimate relationships are ever right outside of heterosexual marriage.
Our most formal link with the Church of England is that we hold patronage for around 150 parishes, which is to say we're involved in the appointment process in those parishes, but we're also involved sort of politics of the Church of England, contending around various issues over the years. We have a publications ministry focusing specifically on matters relating to the Anglican Church, Anglican theology and liturgy and practice. The political equivalent would be a lobby group, but it's a bit more than that as well. It's a fellowship. Part of our political engagement as Church Society, we encourage our members to get involved in these processes. And actually there are one or two Church Society members who are on that Crown Nominations Commission. We're not guiding them or telling them what to do, but we're really encouraged that we have a voice in the room, as it were. And what we feel very strongly is that it's actually very clear in the Church of England's canons and formularies what the role is of a bishop and therefore of an archbishop, that it should be somebody, and this is what they promise to do, to uphold and defend the doctrine of the church. And so we would see that as a very important factor in the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury, that it's somebody who understands and themselves believes and holds to the doctrine of the Church of England and will uphold and defend that doctrine. That doctrine is under attack in a number of ways at the moment in the church, and different bishops and others are seeking to undermine it in some ways, and some are seeking to have it formally changed in some ways. And we would see that as a very serious error. that we should move away from the official doctrine of the Church of England, which is the doctrine of Scripture. That is what it says in our canons. And so that's something that we would want to see taken very seriously in those deliberations, the doctrinal position of the potential new Archbishop, and their willingness not only to believe that and hold it themselves, but to stand up for it publicly within the Church and beyond.
Just to be clear, are you suggesting then that there is no room for renewed interpretation of Scripture, of changes to practice within the Church of England? Because we've had that at multiple points in the past. Are you saying that what the Church of England officially believes and does now is infallible?
I'm not saying it's infallible. I'm saying that the doctrine of the Church of England, which is outlined in the 39 Articles, the Book of Common Prayer, and the Ordinal, as well as the homilies, which the 39 Articles state are a good representation of Church of England doctrine, that is a good and accurate representation of the doctrine found in Scripture. Now, our ultimate guide is Scripture. And of course, there is always room for us to understand Scripture better. What I don't think there is room for is for us to come up with new ideas and new understandings which are contrary to the doctrine found in Scripture. So as you say, the Church of England has changed its interpretation and its practice and its understanding of things like remarriage, for example, in the past. And that is something which is a doctrine that is quite nuanced in Scripture, and it's quite difficult to formulate into a strict kind of policy or a legal thing, because actually it depends on a lot of different factors. So I think it's really appropriate that the Church has taken time to reconsider exactly how it is putting that into practice in order to best reflect what the Bible teaches. I think that practice would be a appropriate thing to do in other situations. If we're seeking to bring our practice more into line with what the Bible teaches and the nuances around that, that is a different thing from saying what we want to do is change the doctrine of the Church of England to move it away from what we find in the Bible because we think we know better.
Let's return to the subject that ultimately set this whole process going. Past actions and inactions that failed to ensure vulnerable people were kept safe from abuse and didn't ensure those failures were properly investigated and learned from. Back to Justin Humphreys of 31.8.
We need to see somebody who is prepared to be courageous, prepared to bring greater clarity and focus to the task of safeguarding. Somebody who is able to at least lead a restoration in trust. Because let's be honest, the record has been patchy at best. Somebody who has got proven track record of dealing with safeguarding matters appropriately, if not well. Somebody who has been able to show that they have taken the issue of safeguarding seriously and that they understand that it is an integral element of our mandate as Christians towards one another.
I should say we did ask a representative of church abuse survivors if they wished to contribute to this production, but we did not receive a response in time for recording. This all leaves a question. With the diversity within the Church of England and the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury in the wider Anglican communion, is it possible for any single individual to faithfully do this job? It's a question I put to both Justin Humphreys of 31.8 and to Ros Clark of Church Society.
It's going to be hugely challenging, isn't it? But I think if the Archbishop of Canterbury is not able to clearly communicate their expectations upon the church that they lead, then we're off to a pretty poor start. The coalface, grassroots elements of our contact with communities around the country, and it's important that safeguarding is seen in all of those areas. But I think that if culture is to breathe into the Church of England a different way, then it requires leadership from the top. and leadership from an Archbishop of Canterbury who is prepared to make the difficult decisions, to communicate the tough messages, and to give people a very clear idea of what they can expect should they willingly, knowingly fail to uphold those expectations. You know, you'd see that in any other environment. So why don't we and why can't we see that in the church? If safeguarding is truly the issue of importance that we would hope it is, then for that to be absent in early communications would be a pretty poor sign and a pretty poor indicator of what we can expect to follow.
The role of the Archbishop of Canterbury within the Anglican Communion is a really important one. The thing which holds together the Anglican Communion. The Archbishop of Canterbury is personally responsible for involving all of those provinces of the Anglican Communion around the world, and indeed in this country. So, for example, the Church in Wales and the Church of Ireland are part of the global Anglican Communion, but they're separate from the Church of England. Now, the Global Anglican Communion is a very broad and diverse church itself. It has a very different feel to it from simply the Church of England, because much of it does not exist in a white Western culture. Much of the Global Anglican Communion exists in the majority world, in Africa, in South America, in Asia, in places which are very different from our own. And I think it is very concerning that that has been paid so little attention to in some of the recent debates within the Church of England, that the changes which we might make here might actually cut us off from the rest of the Anglican Communion, or large parts of the Anglican Communion. And that would be, I think, a very distressing thing for those churches which owe their existence to the Church of England, to members of the Church of England who went out and taught the gospel and planted churches and, you know, brought those provinces into being. But I think that the changes which some would like to see are so significant, and this is actually really serious change in doctrine, which would move us away from the teaching of the Bible, that people in other provinces are saying, well, if the Church of England moves in that direction, we can no longer be in fellowship with them. And I think that's something that any future Archbishop of Canterbury will need to take very seriously, as the Church of England makes decisions for itself, which it's fully entitled to do, to consider the impact that will have on the church worldwide, and whether there will be perhaps intended or perhaps unintended consequences of that will be very serious indeed.
Is there anyone or any short list of names that you yourself and church society perhaps more widely would be very pleased to see take on that mantle?
I personally would love to see somebody from outside of the Church of England, somebody who does represent part of that wider Anglican Communion. There's the Bishop of Congo, the Archbishop of Sydney, the Archbishop of Alexandria, people around the globe who I think would bring a really fresh perspective and a fresh voice into the Church of England, into the discussions that we are having at the moment, who has not been directly part of what has caused such division in the church over the past 10, 20 years, who can come in from an outside perspective and say, well, how this is having an impact on the world around us, we need to think about moving in a different direction, in a different way. And I think it would be very hard for somebody within the Church of England to come in with that same fresh perspective. So that's one thing which I would love to see. There may be other names from the global community which I haven't come across who might equally be able to do that.
We heard there from Ros Clark of Church Society, and before that, Justin Humphreys, the Chief Exec of Christian Safeguarding Charity 318. The Archbishop of York and Bishop of London have been temporarily job sharing on the leadership within the Church of England in the meantime. We did ask whether Bishop of London, Sarah Mullally, would like to contribute to this production, and also asked for the Bishop of Newcastle, Helen Ann Hartley, who was one of the first to call on Justin Welby to resign over safeguarding issues. Their offices both declined our offer. And of course, we've only had time to cover a few of the big issues facing the next Archbishop. When many other churches report increasing interest, especially from young adults, in the so-called quiet revival, but average attendance at Church of England services continues to decline, is the C of E able to respond? With the Church of Scotland having resorted to mass closure of buildings, can local churches and the institutions of the Church of England survive their current financial situation? I'm David Peake, and that's been Life Issues. My thanks for listening today, and do make sure you subscribe to the series.